Joe Thompson, an 82-year-old black veteran, extended his weathered hands, a testament to a lifetime of service, to open the door of the Cozy Corner Café. He was seeking nothing more than a tranquil Sunday breakfast, a simple indulgence for a man who had once fought valiantly for his country. Yet, in Ashwood, a town where prejudice simmered just beneath the surface of its southern charm, even something as ordinary as scrambled eggs could become a battleground. As Joe eased into his booth, he had no inkling that his peaceful morning was on the verge of becoming a defining chapter in his storied life. When Frank, the cafe's owner, approached Joe with malice in his eyes and discrimination in his words, the tension in the room became palpable. In the corner, a group of rugged-looking patrons sat quietly, their presence about to tilt the scales of justice in an unexpected way. But who were these enigmatic onlookers, and how would their silent witness transform into a force for change? Let's uncover the story. Before we delve into this compelling narrative, share in the comments where you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy this video, don't forget to subscribe. The small town of Ashwood basked in the golden light of a serene Sunday morning. Its picturesque storefronts and amiable faces painted a picture of small-town tranquility. Yet beneath this charming facade, unseen tensions festered. Like many American towns, Ashwood harbored deep-seated prejudices and long-standing divides that lurked just beneath its surface. These tensions were about to reach a boiling point in a confrontation that would reverberate throughout the town. Joe lived on the outskirts of Ashwood in a modest home, where the soft morning light filtered through his bedroom window. Rising slowly from his bed, his joints protesting with every movement, Joe carried himself with the deliberate care of someone who had learned patience and resilience. His weathered face, marked with pride and hardship, told a story of a life richly lived. Each wrinkle bore witness to moments of joy and sorrow, while his dark eyes, though clouded slightly by age, retained the spark of the hopeful young man he once was. He began his day with practiced movements, splashing cold water on his face to dispel the last remnants of sleep. Staring into the mirror, he saw not only his reflection but glimpses of his younger self, a soldier with a straight back and clear eyes, brimming with idealism and ready to serve his country. The fleeting vision reminded him of the contrast between his youthful aspirations and the realities he now faced. Joe had served his country with honor, believing his sacrifices would pave the way for a brighter future. Yet decades later, he still encountered the same prejudices he once fought to dismantle. Pushing aside these heavy thoughts, he turned his attention to the day ahead. He chose his attire carefully, neatly pressed slacks, a crisp button-down shirt, and the centerpiece, a military jacket adorned with medals, each representing moments of valor, fear, and triumph. Finally, he reached for his cap, positioning it just so. The simple act transported him back to his first days as a recruit, the pride he felt in donning his uniform still resonating within him, albeit tempered by years of experience and harsh truths. With a deep breath, Joe straightened his shoulders and stepped out of his home. His usual cafe, a place where he was a familiar and welcome face, was temporarily closed for renovations. Rather than seeing this as an inconvenience, Joe embraced it as an opportunity to explore something new. He had heard glowing reviews of the Cozy Corner Café and its famous scrambled eggs, crispy bacon, and house-roasted coffee. Today felt like the perfect occasion to try it for himself. As he walked through town, Joe greeted those he passed with polite nods. Some returned the gesture warmly, while others offered only cursory acknowledgement or avoided his gaze altogether. Though he had grown accustomed to such slights, there remained a painful reminder of the divisions still present in society. When Joe arrived at the Cozy Corner, its inviting facade, a charming storefront with large windows and a hand-painted sign declaring, "Where everyone's welcome," filled him with hope. The warm aroma of coffee and sizzling bacon greeted him as he stepped inside, the bell above the door announcing his arrival. The cafe was bustling yet cozy, with families, couples, and solo diners filling the wooden tables and booths. In one corner, a group of bikers added a rugged element to the scene, their laughter punctuating the soft hum of conversation. Joe surveyed the room, a habit honed from years in the military, and took in every detail: the polished wooden floors, mismatched chairs, and local art on the walls. A young waitress, Sarah, approached him with a bright smile that reminded Joe of his granddaughter, stirring a mix of emotions. "Good morning, sir," she greeted warmly. "Welcome to the cozy corner. Would you prefer a table or a booth?" "A booth if you have one," Joe replied with a smile, her friendliness easing the unease he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. As he settled into the booth near the window, Sarah handed him a menu and offered coffee, which Joe gratefully accepted. The scene around him felt inviting, yet the underlying tension of stepping into unknown territory lingered. Little did Joe know, his quiet breakfast was about to take a dramatic turn, with consequences that would ripple far beyond the walls of the cozy corner. Joe felt a familiar weight settle in his chest, one he had carried countless times before. The look in Frank's eyes was all too familiar, a silent yet unmistakable message: "You don't belong here." For a fleeting moment, Joe considered leaving, avoiding the inevitable confrontation. But a lifetime of perseverance, of standing his ground in spaces where others thought he shouldn't be, kept him seated. He turned his attention back to Sarah, whose warm demeanor remained unshaken. "I think I'll have the special," Joe said, his tone steady despite the growing unease, "and maybe a side of toast, if that's all right." Sarah jotted down his order with a bright smile. "Excellent choice. Our scrambled eggs are the talk of the town. I'll get that in for you right away." As she walked away, Joe took a sip of his coffee, savoring its rich flavor. He tried to focus on the positives: the inviting aroma, the cozy booth, the promise of a hearty meal, but the sinking feeling in his stomach lingered. The warmth of the cafe felt increasingly fragile, as if the peace of his Sunday morning might shatter at any moment. From the kitchen, muffled voices grew louder. The urgency in their tone was unmistakable. Joe braced himself, knowing from experience that this was the calm before the storm. Moments later, the kitchen door swung open, and Frank emerged, his face set with determination. Each step toward Joe's table seemed to amplify the tension in the room. Joe straightened in his seat, meeting Frank's approach with calm resolve. He had faced worse in his life: enemy fire, the harshness of war, decades of prejudice. Whatever was about to unfold, he would meet it with the dignity and strength that had carried him through a lifetime of trials. Stopping at Joe's table, Frank's body language was rigid, his jaw clenched. The welcoming demeanor he had shown to other patrons was gone, replaced by cold hostility. "We're full up today. You'll have to leave," Frank said, his voice gruff and unconvincing, a slight tremor betraying his unease. Joe blinked, taken aback by the blatant falsehood. His eyes scanned the room, noting the empty tables and vacant counter seats. "I'm sorry," Joe began, his voice calm, "but it looks like there's plenty of room. Is there a problem?" Frank's face hardened, his prejudices surfacing without restraint. His voice rose, filled with unwarranted authority. "I said we're full. We reserve the right to refuse service to anyone." The words echoed in the suddenly hushed cafe, drawing the attention of patrons. Joe felt a familiar weariness settle over him, the kind that came from a lifetime of encounters like this. He had hoped, perhaps naively, that the world had changed more during his lifetime. Yet here he was, decades after his service, still facing the same blatant discrimination. Slowly, Joe rose to his feet, his movements deliberate, his dignity intact despite the sting of humiliation. He steadied himself against the table, his hand trembling, not from fear, but from the effort of holding back the torrent of emotions within him. "Sir," Joe said, his voice measured and firm, "I'm not here to cause trouble. I just want to enjoy my breakfast like everyone else." His words carried the weight of years of experience, a calm patience that masked the deep sadness of the moment. But Frank's response was immediate and cutting. "Your kind isn't welcome here," he spat, his tone dripping with prejudice. "This is a respectable establishment." A collective gasp rippled through the room, the blatant bigotry shocking even those who might have been inclined to agree. Joe's heart ached at the casual cruelty, the ease with which his humanity was dismissed. Around him, patrons reacted in different ways, some with visible disgust, others with discomfort, a few with silent agreement. Joe's gaze landed on Sarah, whose face betrayed her horror at Frank's behavior. Her hands gripped her notepad tightly, her knuckles white. She looked torn, her distress palpable, but fear of losing her job kept her silent. Joe felt a pang of sympathy for her, her struggle a reflection of the same fear and hesitation he had seen in others over the years. In the deafening silence, Joe faced a choice: leave quietly, allowing Frank's bigotry to go unchallenged, or stand his ground, asserting his right to be treated with dignity. The soldier in him, the man who had fought for justice and equality, knew there was only one option. Reaching into his pocket, Joe pulled out his military ID. He placed it on the table with deliberate care, the plastic worn, but the lettering clear. "I served this country for over 30 years, Joe said, his voice steady but heavy with unspoken emotion. Frank hesitated, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face before his anger resurfaced. "I don't care what you did," he snapped. "You're not welcome here. Get out before I call the police." The threat hung in the air, a stark reminder of the power dynamics at play. Joe felt the sharp sting of those words, but he stood firm, his composure unshaken. This was not just a fight for a meal, but for the respect and recognition he had spent his life earning. Joe had faced countless battles in his life, and while he had always been ready to fight them, he knew from experience that trying to change a deeply set mind was often futile. With a heavy heart, he turned to leave, his shoulders slumping slightly under the weight of yet another indignity. He could feel the eyes of the other patrons on him, some sympathetic, some indifferent, and a few seemingly pleased with the outcome. This mixture of reactions painfully reminded him of the divided world he still inhabited. As Joe made his way to the door, his mind raced with thoughts of the progress achieved in his lifetime and the barriers that had been broken. Yet, moments like these starkly illustrated how far there was still to go. He thought of his grandchildren and the world they would inherit, and the thought that they might face the same struggles filled him with profound sadness. Just as his hand reached for the door handle, ready to step into the morning sun and leave the unpleasant encounter behind, a sudden noise broke through the tense silence of the cafe. The sound of chairs scraping against the floor echoed loudly in the quiet room, drawing Joe's attention. Turning around, curiosity overtaking his desire to leave, Joe saw an unexpected sight that made him pause with his hand still on the door handle. A group of bikers who had been quietly observing the scene from their corner were now on their feet. Their leader, a tall man with a graying beard, walked toward Joe and Frank with a purposeful stride that commanded attention. Behind him, the other bikers fell in line, creating an imposing presence that drew the eyes of everyone in the room. Joe felt a mix of emotions: surprise at this unexpected development, curiosity about what might happen next, and a tinge of apprehension. He had long learned not to judge based on appearances, but he couldn't help but wonder what these rough-looking men intended to do. The biker leader stopped a few feet away, his sharp, observant eyes flicking between Joe and Frank as he assessed the situation. When he spoke, his voice was calm but carried an undercurrent of steel. "Is there a problem here, gentlemen?" he asked, his gaze settling on Frank. Frank, who had been confident during his confrontation with Joe, now looked startled and uncertain. His eyes darted around the room, seeming to realize for the first time that he had an audience. Beads of sweat formed on his forehead as he grappled with the sudden turn of events. "This is none of your business," Frank said, trying to maintain his earlier bravado but failing to hide the nervousness in his voice. "It's between me and him," he added, gesturing vaguely toward Joe and taking a small step back. Joe remained where he was, hand still on the door handle, caught between leaving and staying. He was curious to see how this unexpected intervention would play out. Years of experience had taught him to be cautious, but something about the biker leader's demeanor gave him pause. The atmosphere in the cafe had shifted, the earlier tension now tinged with a sense of anticipation. Everyone seemed to hold their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. What had started as a simple breakfast had turned into a moment that felt far more significant, a situation teetering on the edge of something greater. Joe couldn't help but reflect on life's unpredictability. He had entered the cafe expecting nothing more than a quiet meal, yet he now found himself at the center of a confrontation that seemed to encapsulate society's larger struggles. As he watched the biker leader calmly hold his ground in the face of Frank's agitation, Joe felt a glimmer of hope. Perhaps, he thought, surprises still existed in this world. Perhaps support could come from the most unexpected places. Letting his hand fall from the door handle, Joe turned fully to face the unfolding scene. He was ready to see how this surprising chapter in his long life would play out. The biker leader's composed demeanor seemed to further unsettle Frank, whose earlier bravado was crumbling under the growing nervous energy. Frank's eyes darted between Joe, the bikers, and the other patrons, searching for an ally or an escape route. But the biker leader remained focused. When he spoke again, his voice was measured yet firm. "We couldn't help but overhear your conversation," he said, his eyes locked on Frank. "And we have a few things to say about it." Frank, his face a mix of anger and fear, tried to reassert control. "This is my establishment," he sputtered, his voice rising. "I have the right to serve who I want." The biker leader nodded slowly, a gesture that conveyed both understanding and disagreement. "You're right," he said. "This is your establishment. But with rights come responsibilities. One of those responsibilities is treating everyone with respect and dignity." As he spoke, the biker reached into his leather jacket. Frank flinched, clearly expecting the worst, but what the biker pulled out was not a weapon. Instead, it was a worn leather wallet, from which he extracted a card and held it up for all to see. It was a military ID, similar to the one Joe had shown earlier. "Many of us here are veterans too," the biker continued, his voice taking on a deeper, more emotional tone. "We've served alongside people of all races, creeds, and backgrounds. We've bled together, fought together, and mourned together." A murmur ran through the cafe as the weight of his words sank in. Joe felt a surge of emotion, gratitude, surprise, and a renewed sense of camaraderie he hadn't felt in years. The biker leader gestured to his companions, and one by one, they stepped forward. Some showed military IDs of their own, while others revealed tattoos commemorating their service. They stood tall, their faces reflecting pride in their service and anger at the injustice they had witnessed. One biker, a black man with graying temples, stepped up beside his leader, his eyes blazing with controlled anger. "We fought alongside people of all colors," he said firmly, his voice cutting through the now silent cafe. "Your prejudice has no place here. It has no place anywhere." Frank, realizing he was outnumbered and outmatched, grew increasingly defensive. His face contorted with a mix of fear and hatred. He looked around wildly, seeking support from the other patrons, but found only averted gazes and disapproving looks. "This is my cafe," he shouted, his voice rising to a near-hysterical pitch. "I have the right to serve who I want." The biker leader, who introduced himself as Mike, remained calm in the face of Frank's outburst. "And we have the right to take our business elsewhere," he replied evenly. "But first, you owe this man an apology." He gestured toward Joe, who had been watching the scene with a mixture of amazement and gratitude. "We stood peacefully, not blocking the sidewalk or stopping anyone from coming or going. Our goal was simply to make our presence known." The officer appeared to weigh this for a moment before nodding. "All right," he said, "as long as you stay peaceful and don't obstruct business or foot traffic, you're within your rights to be here." As the officer turned to leave, Frank stormed out of the cafe once more, his face a mask of disbelief. "You're just going to let them stay?" he demanded. "They're ruining my business." The officer fixed him with a firm gaze. "Sir, they have the right to protest peacefully. If what Mr. Thompson says is true, you might want to reflect on the real reason your business is struggling." With that, the officer returned to his patrol car, leaving Frank fuming on the sidewalk. As the morning unfolded, more people began to gather. Some were merely curious, but others joined in to support the protest. Joe spotted several of his neighbors arriving, expressing their solidarity and outrage over the treatment he'd endured. Local news vans started showing up, their reporters eager to document the developing story. Joe watched as Mike calmly explained the situation to the media, his words carefully chosen yet impactful as he recounted the events and stressed the need for change. Observing this, Joe felt a profound shift in the air. A painful act of discrimination had sparked something far greater. It was becoming a reckoning for the community, a chance for Ashwood to confront its hidden biases and start to heal. Just yesterday, Joe had walked into the cozy corner for a quiet breakfast, and now he stood at the heart of a movement with the potential to shake the town to its core. In the days that followed, Ashwood was a whirlwind of activity. A usually quiet, set-in-its-ways town suddenly found itself in the spotlight. News vans parked along Main Street became a common sight as reporters continued covering the unfolding story of discrimination and the community's response. For Frank, the cafe's owner, the fallout was swift and severe. Images of peaceful bikers protesting outside his cafe went viral, drawing unwanted attention to his discriminatory actions. Over the next few weeks, his business crumbled under the weight of public outrage and a growing boycott. The once bustling cafe now stood eerily empty, a stark reminder of its previous vibrancy. Through its large front windows, passers-by could glimpse Frank sitting inside, looking defeated. The cheerful sounds of clinking coffee cups and the inviting aroma of baked goods had been replaced by silence and the stale scent of neglect. Joe, on his daily walks past the cafe, couldn't help but feel conflicted. Justice was being served, yet it was sad to see a once thriving local business in such a state. He reminded himself that the consequences were Frank's doing, not something he'd wanted to bring about. 3 weeks into the boycott, a new chapter began. Mike and his biker group, recognizing an opportunity for positive change, approached Frank with an offer to buy the cafe. Joe was invited to witness this pivotal moment. They stood in the near-empty cafe, the ticking of a wall clock and the occasional sound of passing cars breaking the silence. Mike's expression was serious as he faced Frank across a table. Sliding a document toward him, he said firmly, "It's time for a change. We're offering to buy the cozy corner at fair market value, despite everything." Frank's hands trembled as he picked up the paper, his eyes darting between Mike and Joe. The once confident cafe owner now appeared a shadow of his former self, worn down by public scrutiny and financial strain. "Why?" Frank asked softly, barely audible. "Why would you want this place after all that's happened?" Mike leaned back, his gaze unwavering. "Because we believe in second chances, but also in accountability. This town needs a place where everyone is truly welcome. That's what we intend to create." Frank studied the offer, emotions flickering across his face, relief, shame, resignation. After a long pause, he signed the document with a trembling hand. As Frank's pen moved across the paper, Joe felt like he was witnessing more than a business transaction. It marked the end of one era and the start of another. A cafe that had once symbolized division was being transformed into a beacon of inclusivity. In the following days, news of the ownership change spread quickly through the town. Mike and his team worked tirelessly to renovate the space, making it both physically and symbolically welcoming. The old Cozy Corner sign was replaced with a new one, Patch and Stripe Cafe, a nod to the biker and veteran communities. The cafe's grand reopening became a community-wide event. People from all walks of life turned out to see the transformed space, now warm and inviting. The walls displayed photos celebrating diversity within the military, the biker community, and Ashwood itself. Joe was honored as the cafe's first customer. Stepping inside, he was struck by how much had changed. The atmosphere was vibrant and welcoming, filled with a cheerful hum of diverse patrons, families, elderly couples, and even groups of bikers all mingling comfortably. Mike greeted Joe with a handshake and guided him to a seat at the counter, the same spot where he'd once faced discrimination. "What do you think, Joe?" Mike asked, gesturing at the bustling cafe. Joe took a moment to absorb the scene. He noticed Sarah, the waitress from before, now smiling as she worked in a stress-free environment. Behind the counter, a new, diverse staff reflected the community's makeup. "It's more than I could have imagined," Joe replied, his voice thick with emotion. "You've turned something painful into something beautiful." Mike nodded, satisfaction evident in his expression. That's what we do, Joe. We take life's ugliness and rebuild it into something better. It's what we did in the service, and it's what we're doing here. As the cafe buzzed with life, Joe noticed a young boy approach an elderly couple. The child's innocent conversation brought smiles to their faces and symbolized a larger truth. Barriers were breaking, and understanding was growing. Mike returned to Joe's side. Following his gaze, he said, "That's what it's all about." Joe smiled warmly, nodding in agreement. This small moment captured everything they had fought for. As the day continued, Sarah approached Joe with a coffee refill, a pin on her apron reading, "Equality serves everyone." It was a small touch but spoke volumes. "Refill, Mr. Thompson?" she asked with a smile. "Call me Joe," he replied, his gratitude unmistakable. Mike raised his mug, inviting Joe to join him. "What do you say we toast?" Joe lifted his own mug. "What are we toasting to?" Mike's gaze swept across the room. To unexpected friendships, standing up for what's right, second chances, and new beginnings. Joe added, "And to a future where everyone feels welcome." Their mugs clinked, a small sound that resonated deeply in the lively cafe. This was more than coffee. It was a testament to the strength of unity, the power of community, and the change that happens when people come together against injustice.